Sun's Parting Ray, Sunset's Hope, Book 1. Written and published by Michelle Austen Whitty. Copyright 2014 by Michelle Austen Whitty. All rights reserved. This book or any portion thereof may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. All characters appearing in this work are fictitious, but they are loosely based on people who have long since died. Any resemblance to living persons is purely coincidental. Narrated by the author. This book is dedicated to the men who died in the bloodiest conflict ever fought on American soil, and to the women who loved and lost them. Requiescat in pace. 1. August 13th, 1862. It rained all night the day I left, the weather it was dry, the sun so hot I froze to death, Susanna, don't you cry. Jane sang the upbeat Stephen Foster tune as she swept the dirt off the front porch steps for the 5th time that day. The hot August wind whipped the dry red Kentucky clay into a frenzy at her feet. She smiled as she remembered the first time she and Ben had danced to that tune as husband and wife, exactly 8 years ago. She stopped singing and glanced over her shoulder. Little Bill squatted down on the floor of her kitchen, banging her good wooden spoon against her cast-iron skillet. The plank floor underneath the skillet already showed signs of returning dirt. Jane angled the broom to more carefully sweep dirt out of her house. Noting the position of the fiery August sun in the sky, she knew Ben would be home from the smithy soon, and she hadn't even started frying the nutcakes for their anniversary supper. She turned to go into the house, but the sound of Martha's crying stopped her short. "Bill, stay right where you are. Mama will be back in a minute," she commanded her youngest son, who gazed up at her wordlessly, his big blue eyes registering no emotion at the urgency in his mother's voice. She dropped the broom and ran around the side of the house where her oldest son and daughter were playing. John Wade and Martha both knelt on the ground, several broken pieces of glass resting on the red clay between them. Jane knelt down beside her 6-year-old daughter. "What happened, sister?" The little girl sniffled, tears mixing with mucus running down her cheeks. "John ran into me and made me drop my mirror." She held out the old hand mirror frame so her mother could get a better look at it. "Did you cut yourself?" Jane asked. Martha shook her head. "Well, then, I reckon it will be all right once we pick up the pieces of broken glass. No more running today, you hear me, John Wade?" The boy nodded, but he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on his feet, which were shuffling the dry dirt back and forth over his black boots. "Good thing those are his everyday shoes," Jane thought with a grimace. John Wade had a habit of sometimes wearing his Sunday shoes to play in during the week. He liked the way they shined in the afternoon sun. What he didn't seem to understand was that the boots didn't hold their shine very well when worn out in the dirt for very long. Jane imagined it might be time to let the boy learn to shine his own shoes. That way he'd know just how much care he needed to take with them to keep that shine. She'd speak to Ben about it when he got home. The thought of Ben coming home reminded her of how she had not yet started supper. She sighed, looking at the pieces of broken glass on the ground next to the forgotten mirror frame. John Wade and Martha had already run off to play some other game in the open field back behind the house. Jane was glad, at least, they were no longer in danger from the broken glass. Still, it's best not to leave it to chance. I should deal with this before supper. As she knelt down, the memory of that ancient superstition danced through her head. 7 years bad luck. She tried to shake the thought away, but it didn't want to leave. Instead, it led to another memory. That night at Grandma Calvert's house 13 years ago, when the big mirror dropped off the wall in the foyer all by itself. Her mother later blamed her for it, but she hadn't been anywhere near it. Lelia, her grandmother's old housekeeper, was in the hallway at the time, so she knew Jane had been nowhere near that mirror. Lelia's words flowed through her mind now. "Someone in this house is going to die tonight." And, the next morning, Jane's mother told her that Grandma Calvert had passed away in her sleep. She shuddered as she picked up the last broken piece of glass in the hand mirror frame and headed back toward the front of her house. She listened for the sounds of John Wade and Martha playing. She could hear them, playing amiably for once. But then she caught the sound of something else. Horse hooves, coming at a fast clip down the lane. Who would come out here on horseback at this time of day? Jane hurried to the front porch and watched for the rider. She recognized the imposing figure on the gray gelding, silver badge gleaming in the sunlight. She gasped, and she almost dropped the glass she still held in her hands. Instead, she tightened her hold, and she could feel the sharp pricks of some of the edges as they made their way into her skin. Her first thought was to protect her children from any news the county sheriff would bring, for a personal call from that man could only mean something bad had happened. She called to her two oldest children, who were happily oblivious to the impending crisis. "Martha! John! Come get in the house with Bill! Right now!" Jane knew she sounded harsh, but at that moment she didn't care. Within seconds Martha and John darted around the side of the house together, obeying without question. But they each cast one curious glance in the direction of the big man on horseback before silently scurrying into the house. They didn't even look up at their agitated mother, who quietly and deliberately closed the Maplewood door behind them. Minutes later, Jane faced the sheriff alone. She tried to stifle the dread sitting like a rock in the pit of her stomach. She smiled and straightened to the most hospitable and welcoming posture she could muster. Good afternoon, Sheriff." Jane's voice quavered a little as she forced her gaze to meet the sad eyes of the lawman. The big man dismounted and removed his hat as he approached her. "Afternoon, ma'am," he mumbled. He lowered his head to stare down at his hat, twisting its brim in agitation. Jane was a little perturbed at the man's reticence. He had, after all, come out here for some reason. What was that reason? But she was her mother's daughter, and the great Southern matriarch had taught her a thing or two about manners. She waited a moment before deciding to engage the man with some Southern hospitality. "Sheriff, may I offer you a drink of water from the well? Or there's some coffee inside." The sheriff started at the offer. His hand never did leave the brim of his hat, though, and Jane feared that he would tear it right off. A shame. It looked to be an expensive hat. He shifted his body weight from his right leg to his left and back again. Jane began to wonder if he'd just headed out here to ask to use the outhouse when he finally opened his mouth. "Mrs. Addison, this is not a social call." He paused for a moment, and his top teeth tugged at his bottom lip. "Oh, hell, ma'am, I ain't no good at this sort of thing, so I'll just come right out and say it. Your husband is dead." Jane blinked and stared at the sheriff for a moment. The world spun around her at an alarming rate. The earth beneath her feet felt dangerous, as if the ground would swallow her up and take her down to meet Lucifer himself. For surely this was the hell her father had preached about all her young life. Not fire and brimstone, no. Something much more frightening. Disorientation and oblivion. The sheriff hurried to Jane's side and helped her sit down on the top step. He rushed past her into the house and came out again in a matter of minutes. Through her haze of grief, Jane saw the sheriff run down the porch steps, through the yard, and to the well. He was back at her feet in seconds. When the big gentleman returned, he knelt down in the red dirt and forced the cup into Jane's hands. She stared at the object in her hand for a moment, unsure of what it was. Then realization dawned, and she took one quick, delicate sip. After the first taste of the cool, crisp water, she regained a little of herself, and took a second, much longer swig. When she'd had all she wanted, she put the cup down next to her and met the sheriff's uncomfortable gaze. "Forgive me, Sheriff. I was not quite myself there for a moment. I believe you said that I am now a widow." The sheriff nodded once. He hesitated a moment before saying, "Maybe I should ride out and go get your father and bring him back. I should have done that before. You need someone here with you." The young widow jumped, ever so slightly, at those words. She hoped the sheriff hadn't caught her reaction, and quickly shook her head. "Sheriff, you told me my husband is dead, but you haven't told me any of the circumstances surrounding his death. I should like to know what happened to him." "Hell, ma'am, you beat all I ever seen." The sheriff clamped his lips together for a moment and started again. "It's this damn war, ma'am. It's coming right to our back door, so to speak." "The war? What does the war have to do with us?" As soon as she said the words, she realized how ignorant they sounded. The war had touched everyone in the nation in one shape or form over the past year. She amended her outraged protest. "Ben's not a soldier." The sheriff shook his head. "No, but that don't matter no more." "What? I'm afraid I don't understand." "You know how some of Morgan's horses and supplies were stolen a while back?" Jane nodded slowly. "Yes, of course. Ben told me of it. Well, ma'am, Morgan wants to know who did it, and the good people of Monroe County don't want to tell him." "No, I can certainly understand why they wouldn't want to tell him. So he thought to make an example of some of our best men to inspire the rest of us to come forward and tell him who did it." A few of Morgan's men rode into town early this morning and captured your husband, along with Doc Robertson and young Ned Turner. They were going to take them across the river to the prison camp, but the prisoners put up a fight. Well, actually, I think your husband and Dr. Bob put up a fight. Young Turner just tried to run. The Rebs shot all three of the men on the road just past Harry Wilkes's farm. Wilkes's boys were working out in the field. They heard the shots and saw the bodies lying in the dirt. The murderers had already made their escape. Then the Wilkes boys come running over to tell me. Jane's mind flashed back to the 3 days Grandmother Calvert's lifeless body had rested in the casket in the middle of her pristine parlor. She remembered how her grandmother's once soft and welcoming arms had stayed rigidly bent up on her chest, hidden beneath the sleeves of that ugly black dress she'd hated to wear when she was alive. Grandmother Calvert had always preferred bright fabrics and patterns, which were much better suited to her lively, smiling personality. There was no smile on her face as she lay in that casket. Jane tried to imagine her beloved Ben in that rigid posture with no smile on his face, but she shook the image from her mind. She realized she'd been wrapped up in her thoughts much longer than any good hostess should be when the sheriff cleared his throat. "I really should go get your father." "No!" Jane cried, louder than she meant to, as she rose to her feet. "Please don't do that. Go get my sister. She's probably in the judge's office. She does some correspondence work there for him once a week." "Your sister, ma'am? Miss Nell?" Jane nodded. Yes, please. I'd so much rather have her here with me." "Well, ma'am, surely your father would be the one to have around here at a time like this, him being a minister and all." "Please." Jane caught hold of his shirt sleeve. The sheriff's shoulders slumped at her desperate touch. "All right, ma'am. I'll go get your sister. Is there anything else I can do for you before I go?" Jane pressed her lips together and shook her head. "No, thank you. Oh, no, wait. There is something. What's to be done about the funeral arrangements?" "Oh, that." The sheriff once again glanced at his feet. The bodies have been taken to the county morgue office and should be ready for viewing within the next day. I can have the funeral director's boy bring your husband back tomorrow evening if you like." "No!" Jane once again embarrassed herself with the force of her protest. "I'd much rather not have his body sitting in my parlor, such as it is, with the children and all. Surely you understand?" The sheriff nodded assent, although the creases around his eyes and mouth told a different tale. It just wasn't right, not having a vigil for the departed in the home. Jane just couldn't bear the thought of Ben's lifeless body being so close to her. She'd much rather remember him as he used to be, strong and vibrant, rather than as a stiff, rotting corpse. "I'll tell the director, then, to hold your husband's body there for the time being. Of course, your father will want to conduct the service." Jane fought the urge to laugh at that statement. Of course the sheriff couldn't be faulted. He didn't know about her father's hostile relationship with her husband. She merely smiled as sweetly as she could. She breathed a quiet sigh as she watched the sheriff hurry off in the direction of her sister's employer. Jane's relief was short-lived. Minutes after the sheriff departed, she heard the front door creak open behind her. 3 little bright pairs of eyes shined out from 3 little faces topped by straight light brown hair. Jane was struck once again by how much alike her 3 children looked, even though their births had each been about 2 years apart. John Wade, her firstborn, was the first to come out the door. He was always the first to do anything. "Mama?" The squeak in his voice betrayed the youth that he tried so hard to hide. Why was the sheriff here? She took a breath. There would be no time to collect her thoughts. She had to come up with an answer, and she knew her oldest son would expect an immediate one. "Something's happened to Daddy," she said, because she didn't want to put off telling the truth any longer than she had to. It was burning a hole through her heart, eating her alive. If she spoke the truth, it would be outside of her, and it wouldn't hurt so much. John's brown brows lowered, and he took a few more steps toward his mother. "What? What happened?" She fought back the tears she'd been holding in ever since she'd heard the news that changed her life forever. She gazed down into her son's earnest brown-flecked eyes, saw a flash of Ben for just an instant, and broke down. Jane fell back down to the porch with a most unladylike thud and buried her face in her hands. Her grief erupted in a thick flood of tears. John instinctively backed toward the front door where his brother and sister still hid. Sensing the fear that gripped the hearts of her children, she quickly composed herself. She stood, brushed the creases out of her muslin skirt, and turned to face them. She did not bother trying to smile. She knew that, even as young as they were, her children could see right through a fake smile. Instead, she reached out her arms to them. All three of her offspring ran to her embrace. Her offspring, not hers and Ben's. She was already beginning to exclude him from her thoughts. Was she trying to erase his memory from her mind? No, certainly not the memory, just the pain of his loss. That was what she was having so much difficulty handling right now. Ben was gone. He went off to work at the smithy this morning, and he would never return to her. Nothing could change that fact. She was just going to have to deal with it and take care of her family the best way she knew how. Jane squatted down so that she was eye to eye with all of her children. She took a deep breath and said the words she'd been holding back for so long. Daddy. Daddy isn't going to be coming home any more. Martha's heart-wrenching cry tore into Jane with an unexpected ferocity. Bill just smiled up at her, not fully comprehending the words that were coming from her lips. It was John that Jane really worried about. Always the hothead. She could see the unbridled rage building up inside of him, the telltale glints of red gleaming through the light brown sparks in his eyes. She tightened her grip on his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, and he tried to squirm away, but she held fast to him. She sighed and addressed the younger two children. "Do you remember what happened last summer to that old black dog that your father—" She choked on the word and swallowed the lump in her throat before she continued. "The dog that your father brought with him from Tennessee?" She waited a moment while the children took in what she was saying. They both nodded their heads, so she continued. "He had to have been at least 12 years old. He was old and sick, and he died." "And we buried him," Martha said in her sweet, quiet way. Jane nodded. "That's right, sister. We buried him because he was dead." She stopped to swallow another lump. "Well, we're going to have to bury Daddy now because he's dead too." John jerked his arm out from her grip and thrust his face forward, just inches away from Jane's. He suddenly seemed much older than 7. Daddy wasn't old or sick. Jane shuddered at the words and the look on John's face as he said them. Her oldest son was growing up faster than she ever thought possible, and now he would have to grow up even faster. It just wasn't fair, not to John or to any of them. They'd all been robbed of the man they idolized and cherished decades sooner than they should have been. John was right. Ben hadn't been old or sick. He was only 32, and he was one of the fittest men in the county. She shook her head. "No, John. Daddy wasn't old or sick." "Then how did he die? Why?" She choked back a sob. "I don't know why, John. I really don't." "How, then?" Her boy wouldn't let up. His chin was pushed out defiantly. Jane wished she could release the anger from his heart, but she worried now that it would be there permanently. The boy had just lost his father. It wasn't a loss he was likely to forget any time soon. "Oh, please, God," Jane silently prayed. "If you can hear me at all, please don't let my little boy grow up to be a hard and angry man. Please." "He was killed on the road going past Wilkes's farm. He was shot by some very bad men who want more than anything to win the war for the South." John nodded his head as if he understood perfectly, but how could he? How much could a boy understand about war, especially a war that had brothers, and even fathers and sons, fighting against each other? Jane wasn't sure she understood much about it herself. She didn't really know that much about it. All she knew was what Ben read to her from the newspaper in the evening, and the news he'd heard in the smithy shop in Tompkinsville that he'd share with her every night after the children went to bed. At least, Jane had thought all the children were in bed when they talked. Now she wondered if maybe John was staying awake at night, listening to their conversations about the war. Maybe he understood more than she thought he did. One thing was certain. Martha and Bill did not understand. Not at all. They stared from their mother to their brother and back again. Then Martha began to cry. Jane automatically reached out and cuddled her daughter. Bill, seeing that someone else was getting the attention that was rightfully his because of his position as the baby of the family, threw himself down to the ground and kicked his legs against the dry dust, stirring it up into a big red cloud that would eventually settle and grind its way into his clothes. Jane reached out a hand to stop the fit, and Bill immediately quieted at her touch. John, too mature to display any sort of childish need for his mother, turned away from the 3 figures on the ground. Jane heard his footsteps and lifted her head to see what he was doing. "John, where are you going?" "Just going to get some wood. You'll need some for the stove when you fry up the nut cakes. There's not much left in the house." "Nut cakes?" Jane stared at her son as if she didn't understand what he was talking about. The 2 younger children did, though, and their sorrow melted away for a moment at the mention of the doughy, delicious treat. "Nutcakes! Nutcakes!" they chorused. "John, you can't—" Jane started to protest, but she stopped herself just in time. She couldn't shield him any longer or keep him from taking on the responsibilities that awaited him as man of the house. Even if he was still too small to wield Ben's axe or carry armfuls of wood on his own, there was nothing she could say to stop him. John would just have to discover his own limitations. Her interrupted protest fell on deaf ears. Her son was headed off to the woodshed around the back of the house before she could say another word. She was balling up the dough for the nutcakes when the sheriff finally returned with her sister. After a quick, wordless nod, the sheriff made his departure. Jane revived from her dreamlike state long enough to accept her sister's embrace. Nell, at 16, was just beginning to fill into her womanly body. Jane knew that many of the boys around town were starting to notice. From what she'd heard, Dan Cockerell had been spending a lot of time outside on her father's front porch in the evenings, and her father was surely not the one he was hoping to see. It would not be long before there was a wedding in her mother's parlor, with her baby sister as the bride. Jane's whole body tightened at the thought, remembering that her own wedding had not taken place in that most sacred of spaces. Nell pushed herself away from the stiff embrace and thrust a bundle into her older sister's hands. Jane stared down at it with blank eyes. "What is it?" "Mama's morning dress. I knew you didn't have anything suitable, so I asked her if you could borrow hers until we could dye some of your other clothes black. You're about the same size as she is now that you've had children." Jane couldn't help but notice her sister's somewhat disparaging comment about her changing figure. After all, it was a fact of life. Having babies changed her body just the same as it changes any woman's body. The left corner of Jane's mouth flicked up for an instant as her sister's thoughtless words danced through her mind. If young Mr. Cockerell had anything to say about it, Nell's own slim figure would be changing soon enough. Jane looked down at her white linen blouse and light rose muslin skirt. She had forgotten that she could no longer wear an outfit like this. She did need mourning. She just hadn't had time to think about it. Thankfully, her sister had thought of it for her. She managed a slight smile in her sister's direction. "Thank you, Nell. I'm so glad I have you as a sister. Did you bring some black dye in from town? The children are going to need something, too." Nell nodded and proudly held up a little glass bottle filled with dark liquid. "I went by Miss Dale's dress shop on my way, and she gave me this. It's dye made from catalpa, indigo, and willow bark, so it will work for both cotton and linen. A little bit goes a long way, she told me, and she has a few bottles ready for the taking if we run out of this." Willow bark. Jane was instantly reminded of a song she'd heard her mother sing at the piano one afternoon during a recent visit. "Under the willow no songs are heard, near where my darling lies dreaming. Naught but the voice of some far-off bird, where life and its pleasures are beaming." The song was written from the viewpoint of a mother who had lost her fair-haired child, but Jane felt the words pierce her heart with a truth she'd never felt before, not even after the death of her own little one, so soon after she and Ben had been married. That baby had been a girl, too, although she wasn't fair-haired. Her hair had been dark as night, just like Jane's other 3 children when they were first born. She took some comfort in the knowledge that Ben and his little baby daughter were now reunited up in heaven. But then another thought struck Jane, one that sent cold chills running down her rigid spine. "How did you get Mama's morning dress?" "I had the sheriff ride me by the house on the way over here, of course. How else would I get it?" Jane's body sagged with a new burden. "So, Father knows." Nell squinted her eyes and raised her right eyebrow impatiently. "Well, of course Father knows. I couldn't very well go in there and ask Mama for a dress without him finding out why, even if he was holed up in his study when I first got there." Nell turned her head toward the stove. "You best tend to that grease in the pan." Jane turned to the stove, where she'd already set the frying pan on the fire. The liquid lard sputtered ominously in the empty pan. She wound her skirt a few times around her hand and moved the pot to a safer, colder position on the kitchen table. "What are you doing, anyway?" Nell asked. Jane started at the question. "I'm making nutcakes." "Nutcakes?" "Yes, we were going to have a celebration supper tonight for our wedding anniversary." Jane choked back a sob as she sank down into the hard wooden chair next to the table where she'd set the pan. Nell gasped. Oh, Jane, I'd forgotten that this was your anniversary. Of course it is. Of all the low-down, rotten things to do, killing a man on his own wedding anniversary. Jane laughed in spite of herself at the ridiculousness of her sister's statement. I'd say it's a low-down, rotten thing to do on any day. Nell pursed her lips. Well, of course it is. I just meant... I know what you meant. Jane kindly stopped her from saying anything to make the situation worse. So, when is Father going to get here? When is he coming? Well, I don't know that he is coming, Jane. Of course he's coming. Ben's dead. What's to stop him now? Nell sheepishly inclined her head down toward the ground. She had to know about her father's strained relationship with her brother-in-law. Maybe she'd just forgotten it. Or, perhaps, she ignored it. Pretended it wasn't real. That's what Jane had tried to do for so many years, without success. Her heart was constantly tugged in two directions, one toward the man she'd come into the world loving with all her heart, and one toward the tall, burly young man who'd swept in from Tennessee and had stolen her heart completely nearly 10 years ago. As if in answer to Jane's question, little Martha came running into the house at that moment, screaming in delight. "Grandpa's here! Grandpa! Grandpa!" Jane gave her sister a look, and Nell backed away from her older sister's irritation. Then Jane sighed and attempted a smile as she wrapped her right arm around Nell's. Together, they walked out to face their father. At just over 50 years of age, Davis Cooper was still in admirable shape. Even though he was a minister and a man of letters, he'd never strayed too far from his farm roots. He owned just over 100 acres of land out behind his house, which he used to plant and tend the tiny brown tobacco seeds he'd brought with him from his father's house in North Carolina. The good Lord had blessed him richly, he would tell anyone who would listen, and Jane always cringed when she heard it, especially the pompous way it always came out of her father's lips. And they pained her, because she knew he wasn't necessarily including her in those many blessings he was always counting. She had always been an obligation, a trial to be dealt with, more than she had been a blessing, and that was something he was quick to point out whenever they were together. The tall man tied his horse to a post and made his way slowly toward his two daughters. Jane felt her stomach churn and waited for the angry bile to make its way up into her throat. She didn't want to be sick right here in front of her father, with her sister and children watching, but she didn't think she could contain it. "Janey," her father said, and held out his arms to her. She saw the pain in his eyes, and felt a little of her anxiety wash away. She fell into his strong arms and wept again. She wept for Ben. She wept for her loss. She wept for the joy at the small bit of progress made in her own reconciliation with her father. She wept tears of hatred for this war that had devastated so much of this nation and now had come right to her front door. Davis waited until his daughter's tears stopped. Then he went over to his 3 grandchildren, who'd kept very close to each other during their time of grief. Davis placed a hand on John's shoulder before he knelt down and hugged Martha and picked up little Bill. "Janey, I'll give you some time to pack up your things. I'll be back here before sundown with the rig to pick you all up and take you home." The words baked the softness Jane had been feeling toward her father into a hard, dry brick. She bristled. "Take us home? But we are home." Her father sighed and kicked a cloud of dirt with the steel toe of his boot. "This is not your home. This was his home." "Ben!" she screamed. "His name was Ben, and even now you can't say it because of the hatred you felt toward him while he was alive." Their mother's harsh words startled the children. Martha and John instinctively backed away from the angry adults. Bill whimpered and tried to squirm out of his grandfather's strong hold. Jane couldn't help noticing this effect on her children, and she cursed her own thoughtlessness. Her father lowered his youngest grandson to the ground, stood, and straightened. "Very well, Jane. You know this was Ben's house." He put special emphasis on her late husband's name. "Ben is no longer here. He is gone. This is not your home any more." "It's the only home the children have ever known. They were all conceived and born here," Jane whispered. Her father took a step back toward the post where his horse was tied. His jaw lowered and shifted forward slightly. "All right. Spend the night here if you wish. I think you'll change your mind when you find out how lonely it will be." I'll come back in the morning to see how you fared." "Oh, it won't be lonely," Nell piped up. "I'll stay here with Jane and the children tonight, sir." Jane noted the slight delay between her sister's statement of defiance and the term of respect. Davis's eyes darkened, and he huffed. Without another word, he kissed his 3 grandchildren, untied his horse, mounted, and rode off toward his farm. Nell giggled, wrapped an arm around her sister, and leaned her head into Jane's. "It's all right, isn't it, that I stay the night?" Jane slumped with relief at her father's retreat and nodded mutely. The 2 young women stood together for a moment. Then they went inside to finish making the nut cakes for the children's supper.